Chapter 1. 3 words ending 8 years. 8 years after I opened my door to my son and his wife, I said 3 words that ended my silence. This stops now. I am Richard, a retired teacher in Cleveland, and this is how my house remembered who it belongs to. Bills in someone else's name, a credit card in mine, a stranger with a badge that was not real, a video trimmed to smear a gentle woman until its own metadata confessed a neighbor who spoke a judge, who listened a son who finally chose his mother. Supervised visits, and a trust for Ethan, and karma arriving on time. I had just settled into my worn leather chair by the window when it happened. 8 years of silence, compromise, and swallowing pride came crashing down in a single moment. I saw Linda, my wife of nearly 50 years, bent over the playpen where our grandson Ethan was fussing. Her hands, delicate and shaking but still so gentle, reached out to adjust his blanket. She had done the same for our son Daniel when he was a baby, and for a second I felt the warmth of our past fill the room. Then Brittany's voice cut through like a blade. She stormed across the living room, her eyes sharp, clutching Ethan to her chest. With a sudden motion, she shoved Linda backward. I watched in horror as Linda stumbled her back, hitting the edge of the sofa before she collapsed to the carpet. My heart clenched. Brittany stood tall over her, clutching Ethan tighter, and spat words that stung more than any strike could. "You are filthy. Don't you dare touch my child." The room froze. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint squeak of the ceiling fan, even the quickened breath of my wife trying to get up from the floor. Linda's face was pale, her eyes wide, not with anger but with hurt. She had endured years of dismissive comments, of being pushed out of her own kitchen, her own bedroom, her own family gatherings. But this was different. This was violence. I rose from my chair, my knees stiff with age, but fueled by something deeper than pain. My fists curled at my sides. My voice, which had softened over years of teaching high school history, now came out rough and sharp. I stepped toward them, looking straight at my son, who stood by the hallway door, frozen and unsure. "This stops now." The words came from a place I had buried for too long. They hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Brittany's face tightened. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching as if he wanted to reach out to both women but could not decide who needed him more. Linda pulled herself up, brushing off her dress, and I saw the tears she refused to let fall. She did not speak. She simply stood behind me, her frail frame trembling but her chin lifted. My heart ached, seeing her pride still intact after being humiliated in her own living room. Brittany adjusted Ethan in her arms and glared at me as if I were an intruder. I felt the rage burning in my chest, but also the weight of 8 years pressing down. I remembered the day Daniel had asked to move back in, promising it would be temporary. He had lost his job at the software company. Brittany was pregnant, and we thought opening our doors was the right thing to do. Family helps family. That was always our way. But temporary had stretched into years. They had taken the master bedroom. They had filled the garage with their boxes. They had turned Linda's rose-patterned china cabinet into a storage shelf for baby formula and cheap wine. I thought of all the nights Linda sat alone in the upstairs guest room while Brittany hosted friends in our kitchen, her laughter carrying up the stairs as if to remind Linda she no longer belonged there. I thought of the times Linda tried to share family recipes only to be told her cooking was outdated and unfit for the baby. I thought of how Daniel, once so close to his mother, now kept his eyes down and his voice low whenever Brittany dismissed her. My voice shook, but I kept it steady enough to be heard. "Daniel, are you going to say something?" He hesitated, his eyes darting between me and Brittany. "Dad, she was just protecting Ethan," he whispered, his tone uncertain. "Protecting him." I let the words sink in. Then I looked at Linda's reddened hands and the spot on her arm where she had hit the sofa. Protecting him from what his grandmothers love. Brittany turned her head away, refusing to meet my gaze. Her grip on Ethan tightened until he began to whimper. She rocked him roughly, shushing him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Linda finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Richard, it's fine. Let it go." But it was not fine. For 8 years we had let it go. We had told ourselves it was easier to avoid fights, to keep the peace for Daniel's sake, to swallow insults, and watch our home change from a place of comfort to a place of tension. Every sigh from Linda at night, every whispered prayer she made at the church pews when she thought I wasn't listening, had been telling me that this day would come. I stepped closer to Brittany, not enough to frighten Ethan, but enough to make sure she knew I would not back down again. My voice dropped, quieter but more dangerous. "You will not lay a hand on her again." The silence stretched. The only sound was Ethan's soft crying. Daniel moved forward as if to intervene, then stopped himself. His face was pale, conflicted, a man torn between loyalty to his wife and duty to the parents who had given him everything. Linda touched my arm, the lightest brush, and whispered, "Richard, please." But my decision had already been made. The line had been crossed. My home, my wife, my family had been disrespected long enough. Those 3 words had been said, and they could not be unsaid. I turned back to my chair, my heart pounding. The air in the room felt heavy charged, as if the house itself had been waiting for this moment. Brittany walked past Linda without looking at her, carrying Ethan upstairs. Daniel followed slowly, his head down, his shoulders slumped. I sank into my chair again, but I did not feel tired. I felt awake for the first time in years. The walls of this house had heard too many compromises, too many silences. Tonight they had heard something different. Tonight they had heard a boundary finally set. And as Linda sat beside me, rubbing her arm, I knew we had only taken the first step into a storm that had been gathering for far too long. Chapter 2: Cracks in the Ohio Home. The storm had been brewing for years, and when I closed my eyes that night, memories I had tried to push aside came back in sharp detail. It was 2015 when Daniel and Brittany first arrived at our doorstep, their car packed with boxes and promises. Daniel had just been laid off from a tech startup in Columbus, and Brittany was already talking about how expensive apartments had become. They asked if they could stay for a few months while Daniel got back on his feet. Linda squeezed my hand when I said yes. Family helps family. That is what we told ourselves. At first it was small things. They carried their bags upstairs and I assumed they would take the guest room. Instead, Brittany asked if they could move into the master bedroom. She said the guest room was too cramped for them and that with a baby on the way they would need more space. Linda and I exchanged a look but said nothing. We moved our clothes into the smaller upstairs room we had once used for storage. I remember Linda folding her dresses into drawers that barely shut, her lips tight, but her words soft. "It's only temporary, Richard." The kitchen followed. Linda loved that kitchen. She had spent decades baking pies, simmering stews, teaching Daniel how to measure flour and roll dough when he was a boy. But slowly, Brittany began to claim it. She reorganized the cupboards, threw out spices Linda had bought, and announced one morning that she preferred handling meals herself. Linda tried to argue once, suggesting they cook together, but Brittany waved her off. "You can rest," she said. "I'll take care of this." From then on, Linda's hands were rarely on a pot or pan in her own home. I remember Thanksgiving that year. The house was full of noise and the smell of turkey roasting. Linda had started the preparations early, but by midday, Brittany had taken over. She ordered Daniel to set the table, moved Linda to the kitchen sink, and told her to keep the dishes moving so they did not pile up. I watched my wife, the woman who had hosted Thanksgiving for decades, relegated to scrubbing plates, while Brittany directed the meal like a conductor. When we sat down at the table, Brittany took the head seat. Linda remained in the kitchen, eating off a small plate by herself. The sound of laughter from the dining room reached her, but she pretended not to notice. That image has stayed with me like a stain that cannot be washed away. Years passed, and the temporary stay became permanent. By 2021, Daniel was unemployed again. The IT field had let him go during a round of cuts, and Brittany still refused to work. She said raising Ethan was a full-time job. The bills piled up, and it was Linda and I who covered them. Every electric bill, every grocery trip, every gallon of gas in their car came from our pockets. I never minded helping Daniel, but the lack of gratitude gnawed at me. Each month, it felt less like support and more like being drained. Neighbors began to notice. One afternoon, while Linda was tending to her roses in the front yard, Mrs. Thompson from next door walked over. She leaned close and whispered something that made Linda's face go still. Later, Linda told me Brittany had been boasting at the grocery store about how she had it made. Free house, free food, free babysitting. She told a friend it was like winning the lottery. My hands clenched when I heard it. That was not gratitude. That was entitlement. I tried to push down my anger. I told myself Brittany was young, maybe careless with her words, maybe overwhelmed. But the pattern grew too clear. She controlled the spaces in our home. She dictated where Linda could stand and what she could do, and she used Daniel's silence as permission. My son rarely looked me in the eye anymore. If I tried to bring up expenses or boundaries, he shifted the conversation or defended Brittany. "Dad, she is just trying to manage the household," he would say, as if Linda had never managed it before. One evening in late fall, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the pie Linda had baked in secret while Brittany was out. We ate quietly in the upstairs room, the two of us hunched over paper plates because Brittany disliked the smell of baked apples and had declared pies off limits. Linda looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Do you think they will ever leave?" I had no answer for her. I only held her hand and stared out the small window at the bare trees swaying against a gray Ohio sky. The memories churned in me like a storm surge, each one adding weight to the present moment. The shove I had witnessed Linda on the carpet, Brittany's voice spitting venom, was not a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of years of disrespect of boundaries crossed of silence that I had mistaken for peace. I could not shake the sound of Mrs. Thompson's words, like hitting the jackpot. The phrase echoed in my mind until I felt sick. We had opened our home out of love, and in return, it had been treated like a prize to be claimed. I realized then that kindness without limits can become weakness, and weakness in the wrong hands becomes fuel for cruelty. That night, after Brittany carried Ethan upstairs and Daniel trailed behind, I sat with Linda in the quiet. She rubbed her arm where she had fallen, her face pale under the lamplight. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and I thought about all that had been taken from us piece by piece. The storm was no longer distant. It was here sitting with us in the very heart of our home, and I knew the next time it broke, there would be no turning back. Chapter 3. Bills with the Wrong Name. Morning light never felt kind after a night like that. I got up early, letting Linda sleep, and went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen was quiet and smelled like lemon cleaner. I pulled a mug from the cabinet that used to hold her favorite pie plates and tried not to think about how many small changes had added up to something we could no longer ignore. The mail was still piled on the dining table from the day before. Linda had not sorted it because Brittany had decided the dining room was her workspace and did not want piles in the way. I gathered the envelopes to clear a spot for my coffee, and a name on a blue bill caught my eye. Cleveland Water, customer Brittany Coleman, service address our street. I stared at the line that should have carried my name and felt a sharp tug at the back of my neck. Maybe it was a mistake. I set that envelope aside and reached for another. Cleveland Electric Illuminating, account holder Brittany Coleman. The room felt smaller. I pulled a third envelope. Spectrum Internet, primary contact Brittany. I laid the 3 bills side by side and let the sight of them settle like a stone in my stomach. I took the bills into the small room upstairs that had become my office after we moved out of the master. I logged into the water account with the email I had used for years. The password still worked, but the profile did not. The account showed a new primary name and a phone number that ended in digits I recognized as Brittany's. Autopay had been set up 2 months earlier. Payment method last 4 digits unknown to me. I moved to the electric account. Same name, same phone number, same autopay. For internet, the change was flagged as a recent update. I printed the account pages and set them on the desk with slow care, as if loud movements would make the facts worse. Back at the dining table, there was a white envelope I had almost tossed as junk. Inside was a welcome letter from a bank I did not use and a first statement. The name on the card was mine. The purchases on the statement were not. A grocery on the west side I never visit. A baby supply subscription. A home goods store with an address in Parma. The opening date was 15 days after Ethan was born. The available credit was nearly gone. My chest tightened, then a cold steadiness spread through me. I called the number on the back of the statement and went through the phone prompts until a human voice answered. I gave my name and the last 4 of my social security number and asked when this card had been opened. The representative said the application was completed online and that the contact number on file ended in 9133. I knew that number. I could hear Brittany answering calls on it from the couch every day. I asked the bank to freeze the card and file a fraud claim. The representative said a packet would arrive by mail and that I should check my credit reports. I wrote down the case number and the time of the call. I stared at the paper until the numbers blurred. Then I took my phone and photographed every page. I did the same with the utility prints from the office. I copied the files onto a thumb drive and slid it into an envelope labeled with an old insurance sticker so it would pass unnoticed. When I went downstairs, Linda was at the sink, with her hands in warm water soaking a dish towel to ease the bruise on her arm. She looked up at my face and did not need to ask. I told her I had found bills with Brittany's name on them and a card in mine with charges I did not make. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she nodded the way she always nodded when bad news arrived, not surprised, only hurt. By mid-morning, the house was moving. Brittany carried Ethan into the kitchen and set him in the high chair. Daniel followed with a tired face. I asked them to come to the table. I placed the water bill in front of Brittany and waited. She kept her eyes on the baby and said she had put the utilities under her name because when she called during an outage, the companies would not talk to her. She said it was easier if her cell was the main contact and that autopay kept things from falling through the cracks. She reached for the electric bill and slid it back to me with 2 fingers as if it were something sticky. I asked about the card and my name. She blinked and said that had to be a mistake. Maybe the store clerk had signed me up without telling me. She said that happens and that I should not jump to conclusions. Daniel looked at me with a thin smile that tried to be soothing and said we were making too big a deal over paperwork and that he and Brittany would clean it up. I told Daniel the charges were not from places I shop. I told him the contact number on the card was not mine. He said stores ask for whatever number you give them, and maybe I had given Brittany's during a checkout because my phone was dead. He said we could talk about it later. He said Ethan needed his nap and Brittany needed to rest. Linda stood at the edge of the room, her fingers digging into the towel against her arm. She did not say anything, but her eyes followed the bills every time I moved them. I looked from my son to the woman who had married him and felt something lock into place inside me. This was not sloppy handling of a bill. This was not a clerk error. This was a sequence. A name change on utilities. A phone number rerouted. Autopay moved to an account I did not recognize. A card opened with my information and used the same month it appeared. It was a chain that connected to a destination I did not want to name yet. I asked Brittany when she planned to restore the accounts to my name. She answered that there was no rush and that things were working fine the way they were. Daniel nodded and said he would take a look next week. The calmness in their voices made me feel as if I were the guest in my own house asking for favors. I told them I would be calling the companies today. Brittany laughed without sound and said I was overreacting and that the stress would not be good for Linda. Linda flinched at that, and I felt a heat rise in me, but I kept my words measured. I said the bills would be corrected and the card would be closed, and that was the end of it. Brittany turned away and began spooning oatmeal into Ethan's mouth with more force than necessary. Daniel hovered, torn and useless. I collected the papers and walked back to the office. I took more photos. I emailed copies to myself using an address Brittany did not know. I placed the originals in the bottom drawer under old lesson plans from my teaching days. I imagined how many times in those classrooms I had told teenagers to document everything, to take notes, to back up what they knew with facts. The advice had felt small then. It felt like a lifeline now. In the afternoon, I mowed the front lawn. The air was cool and smelled like cut grass. Mrs. Thompson waved from her porch. She asked how Linda was, and I said she was resting. She said she had seen Brittany at the market last week, laughing about how smart she was to get all the bills taken care of and how some people did not know how to manage modern life. Mrs. Thompson said she did not like the sound of that. I thanked her and kept moving so she would not see the anger that wanted to break out of me. Back inside, I closed the office door and sat at the desk. I listed what I knew. Utilities changed, autopay moved, card opened, charges made. The facts were plain. The pattern was plain. I thought of the moment when I had told Brittany to stop, and of the long years when I had not said anything at all. Silence had been the soil where this grew. I was done watering it. Before dinner, Linda came in and set a small plate of cut fruit beside my notes. She said nothing. I took her hand and told her we would fix this. Her fingers were cold. She nodded once and left the room. I looked out the window at the darkening street and listened to the small sounds that had always comforted me. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak in the floor near the hallway. They were steady. I would need to be the same. I slid the envelope with the thumb drive deeper into the drawer and rested my palm on the desk. The storm had shifted from memory to plan, and the next move would be mine. Chapter 4. A Family Divided in Two. I started by calling the water company. I gave them my account number and asked when the primary contact had changed. The agent told me the system showed a web update from a new email and a new phone. I asked for the date and wrote it down. Then I called the electric company and the internet provider and took the same notes. Dates lined up like fence posts leading to a place I did not want to go. When I hung up the last call, the house felt too quiet. I could hear Linda moving slowly in the hallway, straightening picture frames as if that small order could restore a larger one. Near noon, the phone rang again. Linda answered because it was a number she recognized. Her voice softened for a second, then stiffened. She held out the phone. "It is Janet," she said. I took it and said hello. Janet did not bother with small talk. She said she had heard from Brittany that we had been making things difficult and that we did not appreciate what her daughter had sacrificed. She said a good mother supports the woman raising her grandchild and that we were being petty about paperwork. She said we were making Brittany feel unsafe and unwelcome in her own home. Her own home. The words scraped. I kept my voice steady. I told Janet that no one had the right to put hands on Linda and that the accounts would be corrected. Janet exhaled through her nose, a short sound like a laugh. She said Brittany was protecting Ethan from germs and chaos and old-fashioned ideas. She said Linda had no business in the kitchen or telling Brittany how to mother. She said if we wanted peace, we needed to get out of the way. I thanked her for the call and told her we would handle our household. She said we had already proven we could not, and hung up. I stared at the blank screen. Linda watched me, her worry showing in the small crease between her brows. I told her to sit. I made tea even though neither of us wanted it. I wished I could carry Linda out of the house and set her down somewhere the noise could not reach her. That afternoon, Brittany sent me a text that read, "Stop involving outsiders." I put the phone face down and went to check on the backyard gate. I walked the perimeter like a man making sure his fence still stood. Mrs. Thompson waved from her porch. She called over asking if we needed anything for the church raffle next weekend. Before I could answer, Brittany opened the back door and told Mrs. Thompson that we were not taking visitors today and that Linda was resting. The words were smooth and polite, but they carried a wall with them. Mrs. Thompson nodded with a sad little smile and went back inside. Inside our house, the wall grew thicker. Brittany began to intercept the house phone and Linda's cell whenever they rang. She told the ladies from church that Linda had a cold and was avoiding company. She told the choir director that Linda needed to step back for a while. She told the neighbor who drops off extra zucchini in summer that Linda was sleeping. I watched as Linda's calendar emptied without her choosing it. She would pick up her phone and sigh at the lack of messages. She would stand at the front window and watch as the Tuesday walking group passed their sneakers slapping the sidewalk in happy rhythm. 2 days later, I saw one of Linda's oldest friends, June, shuffling past with her canvas tote. June looked up and caught sight of Linda through the glass. She lifted a hand, tentative and hopeful. Linda froze. She did not wave back. She stepped away from the window and moved behind the curtain as if she were a shadow. I went to her and asked if she wanted me to call June over. Linda shook her head. Her throat worked and her voice barely came out. "I do not want trouble for her," she said. "Let her walk." I stood beside my wife and watched June's hand drop, watched her eyes lower to the pavement, watched her keep walking. The image felt like a small grief, and yet it was large enough to fill the room. That evening, Daniel came home with a sack of takeout and set it on the counter as if a bag of food could fix the sourness in the air. He told me Brittany was resting upstairs with Ethan and that emotions had been high. I asked him to sit at the table. He sat and started picking at a napkin. I laid the utility notes down without comment. He glanced at them and then looked away. I told him I had filed a fraud claim on the card in my name. He said, "Well, if there is a mistake, the bank will sort it out." He said they always do. I asked if he knew when Brittany had changed the accounts. He rubbed his face and said he did not keep track of paperwork because he was trying to focus on finding a job and helping with the baby. I reminded him that he had told me that for years. I asked if he understood what it means to move another person's accounts and open credit in another person's name. He said we were family and that families share. He said I was reading too much into the details. I felt anger rise and let it pass through me. I remembered the goal: stay steady, build facts. I told Daniel what Janet had said. I told him I would not tolerate outsiders telling us that this house no longer belonged to us. He stiffened and his jaw set. Then he said it. He said, "This is not just your house anymore. This is our family's house now." The words hit with the force of a door slammed in my face. Linda made a small sound behind me and I felt her fingers tighten on the back of my chair. I did not raise my voice. I asked who signed the deed. I asked whose names were on the mortgage and on the county record. Daniel stared at the tabletop. He said none of that mattered because we were building a new kind of family. He said Brittany needed to feel secure. He said Ethan needed stability. He said if we kept pushing, they would move out and we would never see our grandson again. The old fear pressed at me. It would be so easy to back down to keep the doors open. It would be so easy to swallow this one more time. But then I thought of Linda in the kitchen on Thanksgiving quiet, with her plate on the counter while laughter rose from the dining room. I thought of her friend June walking by and the small, hopeful wave that died. I thought of the names on the bills and the charges on the card. I thought of Mrs. Thompson repeating that ugly phrase like winning the lottery, and I did not back down. I told Daniel that our door had always been open and our table had always had a chair for him. I told him that when he was a boy and had nightmares, Linda sat on his bed until he slept. I told him this house was built on our work and our vows and our respect for one another. I told him that if he wanted to stay here, he would respect the people who owned it. He leaned back as if the chair had moved under him. He looked a little lost and a little angry, and a lot like the boy who used to ask me for help with his math homework and resented that he needed it. Brittany came downstairs then with Ethan on her hip. She did not sit. She stood behind Daniel like a sentry. She asked if we were done arguing because the baby needed sleep. Daniel glanced at her, and then at me. He did not repeat his warning about leaving. He only said he was tired. Brittany's eyes cut to Linda and then to the papers on the table. Her mouth tightened. She said we were creating drama and that stress was not good for the baby. She walked past me with Ethan and the scent of baby powder, and her perfume trailed behind like a flag. After they went upstairs, Linda and I sat in the quiet. The takeout grew cold. I tried to make a plate for Linda, but she did not want any. She said she was not hungry. I put the food back in the bag and carried it to the refrigerator, then set the utility notes in a neat stack. The house felt as if it were waiting, as if it were holding its breath between one life and another. The next morning, I took a slow walk to the end of the block and back, as I often did when I needed to think. The trees along our street were just beginning to leaf out. A sparrow hopped along the curb. The ordinary beauty settled me. When I turned toward the house, I saw Linda on the porch. She had a cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, even though the air was mild. She was looking down the sidewalk, and for a second I thought she might wave someone over. Instead, she took a step back into the doorway and folded her arms tight. I climbed the steps and stood next to her. She leaned into me, light and careful. We stayed there for a long minute, breathing together. Inside, the phone started to ring again. It kept ringing until it stopped. I did not move to answer it. I knew who it might be, and I knew the call would not change what had been spoken in our own kitchen. Words have weight. Some words begin to shift the structure of a life. Daniel's sentence had done that. It told me exactly where we stood, and it told me what I had to do next. Chapter 5. The Legal Turning Point. I called Bob Patterson as soon as his office opened. His assistant recognized my name from years ago when he helped us write our wills and told me he could see me late morning. I printed the utility account pages, the credit card statement, and the photos I had taken, then slid everything into a blue folder. Linda touched the folder as if it were hot and asked if I wanted her to come. I told her to rest and that I would be home by lunch. Downtown felt colder than usual, even with the sun out. I rode the elevator to the 6th floor and stepped into a lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Bob greeted me with the same steady handshake he has always had, and the same eyes that miss very little. He let me sit, then waited until I looked ready before asking me to tell him everything from the beginning. I kept my voice level as I walked him through 8 years that had been easy to skip over when they were happening one tired day at a time. I laid the bills on his desk, the credit card statement, the printouts, the notes I had taken with dates and times. He did not interrupt, only nodded and wrote in his legal pad with a slow, careful hand. He said I had done the right thing by freezing the card and filing a fraud claim. He told me to pull my credit reports and place a fraud alert. Then he leaned back and tapped the utility pages with his pen. "This is a pattern," he said. "It reads like someone building a case for residency and control." He warned that if Brittany tried to claim tenant rights, we could not simply change the locks or put her belongings on the lawn. In Ohio, removing someone who has established residence requires proper notice, and sometimes a formal eviction, even if there is no lease, and even if the owner is family. He said those words gently, but they landed like weight on my chest. He outlined a path that sounded like a lifeline. First, a written demand that all utilities be restored to my name within a short, reasonable time, and that any mail forwarding be canceled. Second, a written agreement that set clear house rules, including an end date for Daniel and Brittany's stay. Third, if they refused, a notice to vacate, followed by an eviction filing if necessary. In parallel, he wanted me to keep documenting every change and every bill, and he wanted copies of the bank statement and the call logs with the companies. He also suggested filing a complaint with the postal inspector for mail interference and mail fraud if we confirmed a forwarding order we did not authorize. He spoke about process servers and certified mail and the clerk of courts, but he also spoke about something that mattered more to me. He said that setting a boundary after years of tolerance would be the hardest emotional step but also the most necessary one. He asked if I thought Daniel would support this. I told him I did not know. He nodded and said then we had to build a case as if he would not. He began drafting a letter while I sat there and listened to the scratch of his pen and the quiet hum of an old air vent. When he finished, he read the important parts out loud so I could hear the tone. It was firm without being cruel. It required action. It set dates. It left no room for pretending this was a misunderstanding. I carried copies out with me in a manila envelope. My steps felt steadier on the way to the car. The rigidity that had been sitting in the back of my neck loosened a little. I drove home along the lake and let the flat gray water calm me. Linda met me at the door with eyes that asked everything at once. I told her the plan, the letters, the timelines. She nodded, then said she had been going through the linen closet while putting away towels and found something I should see. She led me into our bedroom and reached to the back of the top shelf where extra blankets live. From behind a folded quilt, she pulled out a thin stack of papers. The top was a blank deed transfer form with our parcel number and legal description already filled in. Beneath it were notes in Brittany's looping handwriting about property tax rates and assessed value, and something scrawled about transfer affidavits. I took the papers to the desk by the window where the light was better. The handwriting was unmistakable. Some notes used numbers that were not listed on the county public site. "Where did she get these?" I asked. Linda said quietly that a few weeks ago, while I was at a doctor appointment, a man had come to the house wearing a windbreaker and a badge on a lanyard. Brittany said he was from the county tax office, that they were doing spot checks, and she had let him in for a few minutes to look at the downstairs rooms. Linda had been in the garden and only saw the man as he left. She had not thought to ask questions. Her mouth trembled as she spoke as if she were apologizing. I called the county assessor and asked if anyone had been sent to our address. After holds and transfers, a clerk came back and said there was no record of a visit, and that their office does not send people door to door without prior notice. I thanked her and hung up. The skin on my arms prickled. I pictured a stranger taking mental inventory of our house while the woman who wanted it stood by with a smile. I placed the deed form next to the utility printouts and the credit card statement. The picture they formed together was not something I could explain away as a messy new mother or a misunderstanding. It was a line that had been drawn carefully and deliberately across the months. I felt anger rise, then settle into focus. Linda stood beside me, her shoulder touching mine. She asked if we were safe. I told her we were and that we were done being passive in our own home. I scanned the deed form and emailed a copy to Bob with a short note that my hands shook while I typed. He called me within 15 minutes and told me it changed the posture. He would include the existence of these documents in the letter and recommend that we notify law enforcement if we had reason to believe someone had impersonated a public official. He reminded me again not to confront anyone alone and to keep everything in writing. He told me to breathe. He said we were not powerless and that the law knows how to handle this kind of slow, creeping theft if we keep our steps clean. In the late afternoon, I walked through the downstairs rooms with my phone recording a slow video of every wall and piece of furniture and the state of the doors and windows. It felt strange documenting a home I have lived in for decades, but it settled me too. This is ours, I thought. This is what we built. The camera lens took in the worn arms of my chair, the oil painting of Lake Erie that Linda found at a flea market in her 20s, the little nick in the baseboard where Daniel had crashed a toy truck as a boy. The house looked back at me, and I promised it I would not fail it again. Later, while Brittany and Daniel were upstairs, Linda and I sat quietly at the kitchen table. Linda's hands moved over the edges of the manila folder as if smoothing a wrinkle that could disappear if she tried hard enough. I told her about the notice Bob had drafted. It demanded the utilities be returned to my name within 7 days, and the mail forwarding ended immediately. It set a 30-day timeline for moving out. It stated that any further attempt to alter ownership records would be treated as fraud. It required that all communication about household administration go through me. Linda nodded at each point and exhaled slowly when I finished. As dusk laid a soft blue over the yard, I remembered a detail I had brushed off when it happened. 2 months ago, Brittany had told a delivery driver to bring a large flat box into the master bedroom while I was in the garage. She said it was a wall organizer. The man had refused to cross the threshold without a signature. She had signed my last name with confidence. It landed in me now with the same unpleasant click as a puzzle piece snapping in. Not a mistake, a habit. I went to the porch and sat on the steps. The neighborhood sounded like any other evening on our street. A dog barked, a bicycle clattered over a crack. A car door shut with a hollow thud. The normal sounds made the next step feel not only necessary but right. I took my phone and called Bob. I told him to go ahead and send the letter by certified mail and to have a process server ready if needed. He said he would file the postal complaint and prepare the notice to vacate in case the first demand was ignored. His voice did not rise or fall. It stayed steady, which helped me keep my own steady too. When I came back inside, Linda had placed 2 cups of tea on the table, even though neither of us felt like drinking. She asked if I was sure. I told her yes. She asked if Daniel would hate me. I told her I did not know, but that avoiding hate is not the same as choosing right. We sat together and listened to the clock in the hallway tick. It sounded louder than usual, like a metronome marking a rhythm I had not heard in this house for a long time. A rhythm of action instead of retreat. I put the folder back in the desk drawer and locked it. I checked that the thumb drive was still where I had hidden it. Then I stood at the window and watched the lights go out one by one in the houses across the street. I could feel the envelope of legal papers on the desk behind me like a small weight that carried more than paper. The next move would no longer be a thought. It would have a date and a stamp and a signature. Chapter 6. A Sun Between Two Lines. Morning brought the envelope to our doorstep like a small square of gravity. Certified mail had that way of making a thing feel heavier than it looked. I set the letter from Bob on the dining table and stood there for a long moment, palms flat on the wood that Linda had kept polished through decades of holidays and ordinary dinners. I could hear the quiet creak of the upstairs floorboards and the soft rise and fall of the house breathing. This would not be another day of delay. I called up to Daniel and asked him to come down. He arrived in a wrinkled t-shirt, hair uncombed, a hand pressed to the back of his neck like a boy bracing for a lecture. Brittany followed partway down the stairs with Ethan on her hip, then turned back as if the air on the first floor was hostile. Daniel sat, and I slid the top page toward him. He read the first paragraph, his eyes moving too fast, then stopped and looked at me as if I had broken some private pact. He said I did not need to bring lawyers into family business. He said all of this could be talked through like adults. I kept my voice steady and said we had tried talking. I pointed to the dates I had written in the margins, the day the water account changed, the day the electric account followed, the day the internet contact was updated, the day the card in my name began to ring up charges. I told him this was not confusion, it was a sequence. He said Brittany had handled the calls because she was home with the baby. He said the card must have been some automatic store sign-up. He said it would all settle down. I asked if he knew any of it ahead of time. He stared at the table. He said he had told Brittany to do whatever was easiest. He said he did not know she had used my information. He said if she had, it was only to keep bills from falling behind. He said he could not be expected to manage numbers when he was trying to get interviews. The words poured out in a tired river of excuses, and I let them run until they thinned. I said the letter gave 7 days to restore all utilities to my name, to remove Brittany's phone as the primary contact, and to end any forwarding of mail. I said it set a move-out date 30 days from service. I said if they refused, an eviction case would be filed. Daniel looked like the room had tilted. He said I was choosing paper over blood. He said Brittany would not feel safe. He said if we pushed like this, he could not promise we would see Ethan. Linda stepped into the doorway, then her hands twisted in the hem of her sweater. She did not speak. She did not need to. The bruise on her arm said enough. Daniel pushed back from the table and paced. He asked to take the letter upstairs to read again. I told him he could read it here. He bristled, then sat and read it line by line. He asked what tenant rights meant in a situation like this. I told him Bob had explained that living in a house for years did not make it yours, that respect and law were not the same as occupancy and habit. He rubbed his face and said things had gotten out of hand. I said they had, and I was done pretending they had not. The day stretched thin. Brittany kept to the master bedroom with Ethan. Daniel drifted between floors, avoiding both of us. Late afternoon brought a tense quiet, then the small relief of the baby's laughter carried down the stairs, a sound that hurt and healed at the same time. I made soup for Linda and left a bowl covered on the counter for Daniel, though I doubted he would eat it. Night settled over the house like a blanket pulled too tight. I turned off the lights, checked the back door, and went upstairs. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint buzz of a phone and the hushed cadence of a voice that wanted to be secret but could not resist the rhythm of gloating. I stepped into the hallway and saw Daniel standing outside the master doorway, his back against the wall, his body still as stone. He was listening. Inside, Brittany's voice rose and fell in soft bursts. The words slid into the hall. I am going to get this house. It is practically ours already. They are too weak to stop me. Utilities prove residence. Mail proves residence. Once it is all in place, they cannot push us out. She laughed under her breath and added that the old man would huff and puff, but he would fold like always. The call ended with a sweetened tone I had heard her use when she wanted something. Daniel did not move. I could see the outline of his shoulders lift and fall, once hard and slow, as if he had been holding his breath for months and had finally run out of air. He turned and saw me. There was no surprise in his face, only a stunned sort of clarity. He did not speak. He walked past me toward the stairs, and I followed at a distance. He went down to the kitchen, pulled out a chair, and sat without turning on the light. I sat across from him. The room felt like an old stage where we had both performed roles for too long. He said he had believed she was just trying to help. He said he had told himself the easy story because the hard one would break him. He said he did not know how to undo what he had allowed. I told him there was a way to start. He had to decide where he stood. He traced the wood grain with a finger like a boy stalling over a test he did not want to take. He said he remembered the winter he had pneumonia, how Linda sat with him all night in a rocking chair, a cold cloth on his forehead, her voice soft as a blanket. He said he remembered how she slipped notes into his lunch bag when he was nervous about a school play. He said he did not know how he had let someone speak to her the way he had seen. He put his face in his hands and stayed there until the refrigerator kicked on, and the sound gave him an excuse to move. A floorboard creaked above us, and then Brittany appeared in the doorway with Ethan propped on her shoulder. The child blinked at the kitchen light when Daniel turned it on. Brittany asked if we were planning more drama tonight. Daniel asked her to sit. She stayed standing, bouncing Ethan, her eyes on me as if daring me to speak. Daniel told her he had heard her call. He said he wanted the truth without spin. He asked if she had changed the accounts and opened the card and filled out property forms with an endgame in mind. She rolled her eyes and said she had done what needed to be done because nobody else in this house could manage anything modern. She said the utilities were a practical matter. She said the card was a misunderstanding that happened all the time, and we were making it into a crime because we were old. She said the property notes were just research for when things eventually had to be formalized. She said one day this house would pass to Daniel anyway, and she was simply getting ahead so there would be no confusion. She said again that everything she did was for the good of their family and for stability for Ethan. Daniel asked if she had spoken with anyone about tenant rights. She smirked and said every woman in her mom's group knew how to protect themselves, and maybe Linda should join a class to learn about boundaries. Daniel's jaw tightened at that. He said no more insults. He said he wanted the accounts fixed and the card closed and the forms put in the shredder. He said he wanted a timeline to leave if that was what it took to stop the damage. Ethan started to fuss and reached for the kitchen clock, small fingers grasping at the air. Brittany rocked him too fast and shot back that I had poisoned Daniel with legal words and that a real man would defend his wife. She added a line that made the room cold. If we do not secure this place now, they will change the will and you will get nothing. Then where will our son live? Something in Daniel broke and straightened at the same time. He said this house was not a lottery ticket. He said his parents were not a bank. He said respect was the price of living under another person's roof, and he had failed to pay it, and he would not fail again. Brittany's face flushed. She said if he turned on her now, she would take Ethan and leave, and he could blame his precious parents when he never saw his child again. The threat hung heavy and mean between the four of us. Linda came to the doorway then and put a hand to her chest as if steadying her heart. She did not speak. Ethan twisted in Brittany's arms and reached toward Linda with that pure baby certainty that love is simple. For a second, everything softened. Then Brittany shifted away from Linda's reach and the softness died. Daniel stood. He said he was taking Ethan to bed. Brittany pulled back and said no. He held out his hands and waited. Ethan made the choice for all of us and lunged to his father. Daniel cradled him, and his face changed the way a face changes when memory and duty line up for once. He told Brittany they would talk in the morning when the lawyer's letter had been read and understood. She crossed her arms and told him she would not be bullied in her own home. The words scraped again, but I let them pass. Daniel carried Ethan upstairs. Brittany remained in the kitchen, eyes hot, chest rising and falling, then turned without a word and followed. Linda and I stayed where we were until the house settled into a tense quiet. We did not speak. We did not need to. The letter sat on the table with its green receipt peeking out like a small flag. Choices had been named, lines had been seen. The night did not feel like a victory, and it did not feel like a loss. It felt like a door had finally been opened to air that had been waiting outside for a very long time. Chapter 7: Courtroom and Collapse. We woke to a kind of stillness that felt earned. By mid-morning, Bob had filed the fraud reports and sent the certified notices. He told me the postal inspector had our complaint and that the identity theft affidavit was logged with the bank. The clerk at Domestic Relations put us on the docket for a temporary orders hearing. He said it would be quick by court standards. It still felt like a lifetime. The courthouse had that familiar chill of polished stone and old air. We sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom with a folder that seemed heavier than its papers. Linda squeezed my hand and watched the hallway. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, staring at the marble floor, as if the veins in the stone could guide him. Brittany arrived with a lawyer I did not know. She wore a pale blazer and her hair was pinned back. She did not look at us. Her attorney whispered to her and handed her a tissue before we went in. Judge Andrews ran a tight room. He looked over his readers at each of us as if measuring our willingness to listen before our readiness to speak. He asked the clerk to swear us in. Bob stood with his legal pad calm as a lake in winter and announced the relief we sought. He said we were asking for temporary custody in Daniel's favor, supervised visitation for Brittany, an order prohibiting interference with household accounts, and a directive to preserve evidence related to suspected fraud. He added that a separate eviction matter would be handled in the proper court if needed. Brittany's lawyer argued first. He said Brittany had been the primary caregiver. He said any changes she made to utilities were practical. He said the card issue was a misunderstanding common in modern retail. He said the video that had circulated among a few family contacts showed Linda unstable, and that Brittany had a duty to protect her infant from unsanitary conditions. He passed up a printed still from a video on a phone and set it on the rail as if it were a verdict. Bob did not raise his voice. He opened our binder and walked the judge through the pages the way a teacher marks a lab report. He pointed to the utility records with date stamps of changes and the phone number attached to Brittany. He pointed to the bank letter confirming the online application in my name. He noted the fraud alert placed on my credit report. He then addressed the video. He explained that Daniel had provided a cloud backup from his phone contents that included a copy of the original clip and the edited version. He handed up a one-page summary from a technician that listed the file creation and modification times and the software used to export. He did not make it dramatic. He simply said the clip had been altered to remove context and to exaggerate a moment when Linda's hands shook. Judge Andrews asked Daniel to step forward. Daniel spoke quietly but clearly. He said he had heard Brittany on a phone call planning to use residency markers to keep the house. He said he had reviewed bills and accounts and believed changes had been made without permission. He said he loved his child and wanted stability. He said he intended to file for divorce and would seek full custody. The judge asked him if he could provide day-to-day care. Daniel nodded and said he had the support of his parents and that he was actively looking for work with hours that would allow him to be present. He sounded like a man who had rehearsed a harder speech for himself in the dark and now found this one within reach. Mrs. Thompson testified next. She clutched her purse the way older women do when they want to be brave without shaking. She told the court she had heard Brittany brag at the market about having everything free and how that was the smart way to do things if your in-laws were soft. She said she did not want to be involved, but she could not ignore what she had heard. She looked at Linda when she left the stand, and her eyes were warmer than any heating vent in that cold room. Brittany did not stay warm. Her attorney tried to keep her seated and silent, but she tugged at his sleeve and stood anyway. She said she had done nothing but care for her family. She said Linda was unhygienic. She said the video was real. Bob asked for permission to play the original clip. The judge nodded. The screen showed Linda adjusting a blanket in a careful, deliberate way. It showed Brittany entering the frame, taking the baby, and telling Linda to get out of the kitchen. It showed nothing unsanitary. It showed a grandmother with a shaking hand being shamed. The judge watched without speaking. When the clip ended, he removed his readers and set them on the bench. He asked Brittany if she understood the seriousness of altering a record to damage the credibility of another party. She started to talk about stress and sleep deprivation and the pressure of living in someone else's house. Then she pivoted. She said if the court took her child away even for a weekend, she would take him and go somewhere none of us could find her. The words hit the air and did not die there. They sank like a stone. The judge held up a hand. He spoke slowly, and each word seemed to find its place before the next one came. He said threats about withholding a child reflect poorly on the person making them. He said courts do not reward coercion. He looked at Daniel. He asked if he could provide a stable place for Ethan tonight if needed. Daniel said yes. He spoke with the same steady tone he had used when he was a boy reading lines from a school pageant and wanted to be sure he got them right. Bob asked permission to add one more exhibit. He placed the blank deed transfer form with our parcel number on the rail. He explained where Linda had found it. He noted my call to the assessor and the response that no visit had been recorded. He did not accuse Brittany of impersonation. He asked the court to order all parties to preserve any documents related to property or mail and to restrict any further attempts to alter ownership records. Brittany's lawyer objected on the grounds that this was a family hearing, not a criminal one. The judge said he was well aware of his jurisdiction and that orders to preserve evidence were appropriate, where the best interests of the child were tied to the stability of the home environment. Linda testified for the shortest time of anyone. She spoke a few sentences. She said her house had become a place where she felt unwelcome. She said she had been pushed and that she feared losing her grandson. She said she wanted peace. Her voice did not tremble. It carried the weight of a person who has spent a lifetime being steady for others. The judge took a breath and told us he would rule from the bench. He said the court grants temporary sole custody to Daniel. He said Brittany may have supervised visitation at the Cleveland Family Center twice weekly for 2 hours per session, with a schedule to be arranged by the center. He ordered both parties not to disparage each other in front of the child. He ordered that Brittany not remove the child from the county without a further order. He ordered that all utilities be placed back in my name within 7 days and that no new accounts be opened using my information. He ordered that any mail forwarding not initiated by me be canceled. He ordered that all electronic files and devices containing videos or documents related to the parties be preserved. He set a review hearing for 30 days. Brittany began to cry. It was not the quiet kind. It came in sharp bursts that sounded like sirens in a tunnel. She said we had turned Daniel against her. She said the court was biased against mothers who stayed home. She said Linda had orchestrated this because she could not stand another woman in the kitchen. The judge did not engage. He repeated the schedule and told the bailiff to hand each side a written summary. He told Brittany that any attempt to avoid supervised visitation or to interfere with the orders would be held against her in the final custody decision. Daniel spoke then. He said he would be filing the divorce by the end of the week. He asked the court to note his request for primary residential custody in the final decree. He also asked that exchanges be done at the center to avoid conflict at the house. He did not look at Brittany while he spoke. He looked at Ethan sleeping in the stroller next to the rail. Something like resolve settled on his face, not triumphant, only sure. We left the courtroom into a hallway that felt briefly brighter. Linda held my arm. Mrs. Thompson touched Linda's shoulder and then slipped away, her duty done. Bob handed me copies of the orders and told me he would coordinate with the family center and with the bank and with the postal inspector. He said there would be hard days and that we had done a hard thing today. He said to go home and rest and to change nothing we could not prove later we had not changed. Outside, the air had that lake smell that never quite leaves downtown. Daniel walked beside us, pushing the stroller. For a moment, we were just 4 people on the same sidewalk with a sleeping child in the shade of a small canopy. Then Brittany came out of the doors with her attorney and stopped a few paces away. She did not speak. Her face had that polished anger I had come to recognize. She turned and left with quick, tight steps, her heels clicking a hard rhythm on the stone. We did not follow. We stood on the steps long enough to feel the heat of the sunlight soak through our coats. Linda closed her eyes and lifted her face, as if to warm a part of herself that had been cold all winter. Daniel looked down at Ethan and then up at me. He did not thank me. He did not need to. The orders in my pocket were thanks enough. We had a plan. We had a path. The next hearing was on the calendar, and the house would be waiting for us unchanged for the first time in a long time. Chapter 8. 3 years later. Justice served. The weeks that followed moved in the careful rhythm of calendars and signatures. Utilities shifted back into my name with the kind of speed that appears when a judge has already spoken. The postal inspector called to confirm the forwarding order had been canceled. The family center set a standing schedule for supervised visits. Bright rooms with plastic blocks and soft chairs where a staff member watched the clock while Ethan stacked towers and knocked them down. Daniel kept every appointment. Brittany missed 2, then arrived early for the 3rd, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Nothing about it felt like peace, but it felt like order, and order is a kind of mercy. Bob filed the divorce and the custody petition. He kept his sentences short in his emails, and I came to be grateful for every simple verb in black and white. Brittany hired a new attorney, and then another one. The criminal side took longer, as it always does. Investigators collected what Bob had already organized. The bank sent formal confirmations. The county reviewed the report of the man who had pretended to be from the tax office. Brittany eventually stood in a courtroom without a blazer, her hair pulled back with the same rigid precision, and agreed to a plea. 2 years probation, community service, restitution for our legal fees, orders to stay away from our accounts and not to contact us outside scheduled exchanges. I did not feel triumph when I heard the sentence. I felt something like a knot loosen, the way a tightened rope gives a small sigh when it is finally unhitched. Daniel moved into the spare room at the top of the stairs with Ethan's crib beside his bed. We rearranged the house as if rearranging could heal it. Linda reclaimed her kitchen in small steps at first. A pot of soup that smelled like real autumn. A tray of cookies cooling on a rack that had been hidden under the sink. She stood there with a wooden spoon and laughed at herself when she burned the first batch. I watched color return to her face the way a sunrise pulls pink across a gray lake. Daniel learned the routines that mothers everywhere know. He measured formula in the bleary blue of early morning. He folded laundry over the back of a chair when Ethan fell asleep on his chest. He set his phone on silent. He started answering emails again and picked up contract work fixing laptops for a school district. Spring in Cleveland does not rush, but when it comes, it arrives with a clean smell that feels like new promises. On a Saturday in April, Linda and I went with Daniel to a used furniture store on the west side and found a dresser for Ethan with drawers that slid smooth and easy. The man at the counter said the wood was better than anything new. Daniel nodded, and I saw something steady settle in him again. He strapped the dresser into the trunk of our old sedan and thanked the man twice. Supervised visits continued. Brittany bought Ethan little outfits and held him for the exact number of minutes allowed. She told the staff she was taking parenting classes and brought worksheets on gentle discipline. When the hour ended, she patted Ethan's back and handed him to Daniel with a practiced smile. Sometimes she left without a word. Sometimes she lingered in the parking lot and watched Daniel buckle Ethan into the car seat. She waved once with a small lift of her hand. Daniel waved back and kept moving. The final custody hearing was quieter than the first. The judge reviewed the guardian report and the logs from the center. He asked Daniel how work was going. Daniel said stable and smiled in a way that looked like it belonged to him again. He asked Brittany if she had completed her service hours. She said she had. He asked both of them if they understood the order he was about to sign. They said yes. Primary custody to Daniel. Visitation for Brittany as scheduled. Exchanges at the center. No exceptions without court approval. He signed his name. A bailiff stamped the copies. We walked out with 4 sheets of paper that held the shape of our new life. The house felt different after that. Not larger or smaller, just honest. Daniel and Ethan stayed with us through a winter that turned the backyard into a field of white. We made snow paths the way we had when Daniel was 5. Linda tied a scarf around Ethan that made him look like a little pumpkin and pushed him on a plastic sled while Daniel shoveled the walk. At night when the house was quiet, I would stand at the window and look at the porch light across the street and think about how many families carry hidden storms behind lit curtains. I wished all of them the same relief I felt, then a soft place to set down a heavy thing. News about Brittany reached us through legal updates and the kind of neighborhood channels no one admits to, but everyone uses. She remarried quickly to a man from Parma who worked in roofing. For a few months there were pictures of smiling dinners and trips to the zoo where everyone wore matching colors. Then the report shifted. She did not like his mother. She moved his tools into labeled bins and then locked the garage when he made her angry. She told his sister how holidays should be run and which dishes were inappropriate. She tried to add her number to his bank alerts and signed for a package as Mrs., with his last name in handwriting that looked unnervingly familiar. The family caught on. The pictures stopped. She moved out. I took no joy in hearing that. Karma is not a celebration, it is a mirror. Some people never look into it long enough to change. In the spring of 2026, Daniel found a small ranch house 10 minutes from us on a quiet street with 2 maple trees and a chain-link fence. The day we walked through it, the air smelled like floor polish and fresh paint. Daniel stood in the living room with his hands in his pockets and said, "This feels safe." He signed papers with a clear hand. After closing, we spent a weekend hauling boxes in the trunk of my car while Ethan ran in the grass with a foam bat. Linda brought over lasagna and set it on a counter that had never been used. She stuck a note inside the freezer with reheating instructions and laughed when Daniel rolled his eyes and thanked her anyway. We hung a framed picture of Lake Erie over the couch to make the place feel like ours and not just his. He said leave it for now, and I decided to take him at his word. Back at our house, life settled into a slower pattern that felt like repair. Despite the years on her shoulders, Linda moved as if a new current had taken hold in her. She joined the church choir again and went on Tuesday walks without glancing over her shoulder. Mrs. Thompson brought zucchini and stayed for tea. Sometimes when Linda thought I was not looking, she stood at the doorway and breathed in, as if taking the measure of the quiet and finding it acceptable. Bob came over one afternoon with a red folder and a simple smile. We sat at the dining table, the same wood now used for honest conversations, and updated our will. We created a trust for Ethan that would cover school and whatever future looked like for a boy whose first steps had been careful and brave at the same time. We named Daniel as trustee and added language that would keep the trust safe from the kinds of shortcuts that had almost cost us our home. Linda signed with steady hands. I signed after her, and for once my signature did not shake. The rose garden returned to itself that summer. Linda pruned with a patience that made the bushes respond like grateful pupils. Pink and red and creamy white opened along the fence. Ethan turned 3 that July and came over with a plastic watering can he carried like a trophy. Linda showed him how to tip it gently so the water pooled around each plant instead of running off. He nodded as if memorizing a secret. Then he splashed because he was 3 and because joy is a kind of lesson too. He chased a butterfly in a zigzag path that made Linda laugh out loud. I stood near the porch and watched them, the two of them framed by roses that had known drought and bloom and drought again. I thought of the first time I had said the 3 words that changed the direction of our lives. I thought of the courtrooms and the envelopes and the steady scratch of Bob's pen. I thought of Daniel's face when he chose his son over the path of least resistance. I thought of Brittany walking away in her new shoes, and of how walking away does not always mean learning anything. Then I looked at Linda and Ethan playing her hand on his shoulder as he leaned close to a flower to check for bees, and I knew the story had landed where it needed to land. Not in victory, in order, not in triumph, in care. As the sun dropped behind the maple trees and the petals caught the last light, Ethan ran to me with damp shoes and held up a leaf like a prize. I bent to him and let him tell me about the best leaf in the whole yard. Linda wiped dirt from his cheek with the corner of her sleeve, and I felt a peace I had not trusted in a long time. The house behind us stood the way a house should stand, not as a prize to be claimed, but as a promise kept. If you believe that respect in a family is not something to bargain away, stay with us for more stories like this and share the ones that matter to you.